Welcome to the 2020 Pasadena Festival of Women Authors online. I'm Nora Morley, the chairperson for the 2020 festival. Although we were unable to hold our event in person this year due to the coronavirus, we are so happy to present all 7 of our festival authors online in videos like this one. Our mission is to recognize the accomplishments of women authors, to advance community dialogue about literature, and to raise money for nonprofit literary programs. I want to thank the volunteers on our committee for all of their hard work. Since the first year in 2009, they have presented over 55 authors and have raised over $350,000 for grants to the community. With the proceeds of our 2019 event, we were able to make grants to the One City, One Story program at the Pasadena Public Library, the Pasadena City College Writer-in-Residence, Visiting Writer, and Summer Creative Writing programs, the Pasadena Senior Center Masters in Learning program, the Penn America Emerging Voices Fellowship program, and Writer. The signature of our festival is that our authors tell us their personal story, the story of their journey as a writer and as a woman. First, our author will be introduced by a member of our author selection committee. Then the author will speak about her journey. And lastly, there will be a question and answer session. Before we go to our author stories, I would like to thank our sponsors for their generosity. Our lead sponsor at the publisher level, Clifford Swan Investment Counselors, and our sponsors at the editor and novel levels. We hope that you'll consider making a donation and purchasing our authors' books through the links at the end of this video or by going to our website. And now, enjoy this author's story.
Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could join us today. My name is Amy Ulmer, and I am chair of the Author Selection Committee. I am both excited and honored to introduce our first speaker for the first ever online Festival of Women Authors, Laila Lalami. Her latest novel, The Other Americans, generated rave reviews and incredible press and honors. A finalist for the National Book Award and one of Time Magazine's Best Fiction of 2019, the novel was also the choice of the Los Angeles Times Book Club last year. Accolades continue to come Lalami's way, and we are so privileged to have her join us. Her previous novels include The Moore's Account, which among other awards was a finalist for the Man Booker Prize and the Pulitzer Prize. Her nonfiction work, Conditional Citizens, will be released on September 22nd, and I know you are going to want to read it. Born and raised in Rabat, Morocco, Lalami was educated there and in Great Britain and the United States. Both a Fulbright Fellow and a Guggenheim Fellow, she earned her master's degree in linguistics at University College London and her doctorate in linguistics at USC. The Other Americans is a moving saga of family, love, grief, immigration, and murder. Set in the Mojave Desert, the story is told from the perspective of 9 distinct characters, which means that Lalami had to get into each of those characters' heads and find their voices. With a strong sense of place, Lalami asks us the question, who gets to call themselves American? She raises issues that are pertinent to today's political climate, while at the same time engrossing her readers in a story of the heart. What a terrific way to begin our author talks. Again, I am so excited to introduce to you Laila Lalami. Hi, Laila.
Hi.
I know you're just across town, but we're doing a little bit of social distancing here. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you so much for asking. And thank you all for being here. It really is a delight and an honor to speak to the Pasadena Women Writers Festival.
Well, we're so happy to have you with us. Our audience is looking forward to hearing you tell the story of your writer's journey. Can you talk to us about that?
Of course. The story of the other Americans begins 6 years ago in the spring of 2014. I had just turned in the copy edits for my novel, The Moor's Account, which is a historical novel about an enslaved man from Azamor on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. He was brought with a Spanish expedition to the territory of La Florida in the spring of 1528. And the goal was for this expedition to claim that territory for the Spanish crown. They were looking for gold, and of course there is no gold in Florida. And in short order, a lot of things go wrong, including, by the way, disease. There was an epidemic at one point. And I was attracted to this story because it's a story of identity and transformation. This man begins as an enslaved man in Morocco and then turns into a castaway, and then he becomes an explorer, and then he becomes a sort of leader to a group of conquistadors and Native Americans. And I had spent 5 years on the research and writing of that novel, really immersed in a very formal 16th century voice. And I felt quite tired, and I wanted a change of pace from that kind of writing. I wanted to work on something more contemporary. And I wasn't quite sure what story it would be, but I knew I wanted it to be contemporary. I wanted to get away from historical novels. I also knew that whatever I worked on next would likely involve a story that also had to do with identity and transformation. These two themes have been recurrent in my work, and I wanted to work on them on a different canvas, in the contemporary canvas. Well, as it happened, that summer, I received a text from my sister telling me that our father had taken gravely ill. And so I had to sort of scramble and get on a plane to Morocco to go visit him. And all of us are right now under lockdown in our various cities, and even within the city of Los Angeles. So many of us probably know what it's like to hear that a loved one is sick, but that you can't visit them. Well, that is the condition of the immigrant, which is that you live thousands of miles or tens of thousands of miles away from your loved one, and you can't, when they need you, you can't just be right there for them. So sometimes it takes time, and sometimes it takes a great deal of effort and money to go and visit them. So after I returned to Los Angeles from that visit in Morocco, I started to think about the sort of ripple consequences of a decision I had made more than 20 years earlier to immigrate to the United States. When you're in your 20s, and I always say this, when you're in your 20s and you're drunk on love, you don't really imagine, and you say yes to being an immigrant, you don't really imagine what the consequences will be 20 years later, including this sort of dislocation from your home country and this sense that you can't be there for your family when they need you. And so I got to thinking about that, about more widely the choices that we make when we're younger and how they affect us decades later. I was born and raised in Morocco. I grew up in Rabat, in a family that was filled with book lovers. Everybody in my family loved to read. My parents had not gone to college, and books afforded them both an escape from reality, an education about the wider world, a sense of order amid the chaos. And it was, I really did not realize until I became an adult what a great fortune I had as a child to grow up among book lovers and people who just loved reading. And so it was very natural for me that from a young age, I fell in love with books. In fact, I don't remember a time when I did not read. And when I say that I read, I don't mean that we were cracking open Tolstoy every night. It was a really diverse reading experience. My parents read everything from mysteries, thrillers, memoirs, nonfiction on various themes. And so when I was little, of course, I started out reading comic books, and then from there on to adventure stories, what today is called well, a lot of it today would be called YA, romance, even crime. It was just everything. And so it was a really very wide ranging reading experience. And then after high school, I had this idea. So in Morocco, high schools specialize at an early grade, and I was in sort of the science track. And so my idea had been that I would become a physician. But after I finished my high school, I thought, well, I enjoy reading so much, and I had just taken 3 years of English as a foreign language in high school. So after high school, I decided to switch tracks and turn into an English major. And so this is what I mean when I say that decisions that you make decades ago can affect you to today. Had I not decided to major in English, I probably would not have gone on to do a master's degree in linguistics at the University of London, and then later a doctorate here in Los Angeles at USC. So each decision led to other decisions, which is why I'm sitting here today in LA. So these are sort of the themes that were kind of percolating in my head. I myself had turned from a sort of foreign student in the US into an immigrant and eventually into a citizen. So these are transformations that are occasioned by the world in which we live, by the particular landscape in which I live. And I wanted to write a story that kind of address all of these themes. So long-term decisions about the choices that we make, a story about home and about family, and as Amy mentioned earlier, about love. I do insist on love in this story. So The Other Americans begins with the death of the family patriarch. And as he dies, it forces the family back together into the same house, so to speak. The book begins with him dying in a hit and run accident, and his daughter, Nora, starts the narration. She's a jazz composer. She's a musician who is based in the Bay Area, not yet successful in her field, and sort of feels like the bohemian of the family, if you will. And she is forced to return home when the father is killed in the hit and run. There is the mother. She's the mother, the wife, and business partner of this man who just died. And then there's the sister, Salma, who was brought to the US with her parents when she was still a toddler. The parents immigrated to the United States in 1981 following some political trouble that the father got into, Dries, the father. And so the book opens with him being killed in this hit and run, which is slightly ironic because the family had come to the United States seeking safety from political trouble. And of course, we know 35 years later, he ends up killed under these very mysterious circumstances. The other characters who narrate the story include Jeremy, who's an Iraq war vet, a sheriff's deputy, and a childhood friend of Nora's, and who turns, in the story, he turns into a love interest. There is the detective who's investigating the hit and run. Her name is Coleman, and she moved to the Mojave from Washington, D.C. And then there is Efrain, who's the witness to this crime, but he is afraid to come forward because he's undocumented. Then there is Anderson Baker, who is a business rival of Dries and also a neighbor. And there's Anderson's son, AJ. So there are 9 different characters that take turns narrating the story. This is a story, as I said, of family, but it's also a story of community. And by extension, it's a story about America. And in order to tell this story about the country, it really required me to use these different voices. Initially, when I started working on the book, I mentioned earlier that I wanted it to be a contemporary story. I also wanted to sort of get away from a single voice narrating the story. I had done that with the Morse account. It was it was immersed in his voice for 400 pages. And frankly, I wanted to experiment with something different. And when I started working on the Morse account, I had initially included only 3 voices, but through the process of writing and rewriting the book, it turned into these 9 voices. So it ended up being a polyphonic novel, if you will. And that kind of experiment for me as a writer was really a joy and such a great learning experience. And part of what makes writing so attractive to me is that you can do so much with it, and you can do so many different things with each new book. I don't like to work on the same type of book with each one. I like to sort of mix it up. So in writing a polyphonic novel, I had never done that before. And before writing the Morse account, I had never written the historical novel either. But so this one was really different. And in approaching the challenge of writing a polyphonic novel, I decided that, sometimes I joke, if I had known it was going to be 9 narrators, maybe I wouldn't have done it. It was really kind of grew organically out of the story. But the way that I approached it was not to write all 9 voices at once, but to write each voice in turn. So the writing was sort of serial or sequential, if you will. And in doing that, it enabled me to immerse myself in each voice and focus on that voice one at a time. The other thing is that in creating different voices, I faced the challenge of how to make each one different and its own from the others, obviously. And the way that I handled this was to focus on a different element of voice with each character. So for example, with the mother, Mariam, if you read the book, you will notice that her chapters contain a lot of run-on sentences. So she really speaks in the sort of very loose style that really is how some of my cousins speak. And I wanted to kind of capture that in the writing. So it's really playing with syntax. With the voice of someone like Jeremy, I focused more on lexical choices or lexicon, like what kind of jargon does an Iraq war veteran use? What kind of a jargon does a sheriff's deputy use? And so that's something that I kind of immersed myself into with research and with listening and watching sometimes also movies. So it's basically trying to pick up as much of the jargon as possible and then using that in crafting the voice. Or it could be in the case of the witness, for example, Ephraim, his voice is meant to be a sort of translated voice. So that was another challenge and a fun experience because he's Spanish speaking, but the novel is in English. And so it kind of is meant to render his voice. And it's in that mix of voices and characters that I hope to render this idea of community in the book. One of the questions that I get asked a lot, and I did particularly with this book because about half of the characters are not Moroccan, and I am Moroccan. So the idea is, how do you write about characters from different cultures? And my answer usually with questions like this is to begin with humility. And you know how in the Hippocratic Oath, the first line is I think it's in the Hippocratic Oath, it's first line is first do no harm, right? And so in approaching writing characters from different cultures, the most important thing is to begin with understanding that maybe you don't know that culture as well as you think that you do. And so it's very important to educate yourself about it. So with each of these characters, I endeavored to research as much as I could about their background. So it could be, you know, what kind of a job do they have? I have a sheriff's deputy in my book. And so I went on a ride along with a sheriff's deputy from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. So I spent 12 hours with him in the car and I got to see what a shift, what a regular shift might be like for this officer. I spent some time with a friend of mine who was a former DA in the prosecutor's office here in Los Angeles. I read widely. I decided to subscribe to local papers, and I would read the police blotter, and I would like actually look at what kinds of crimes and day-to-day things that are not crimes, frankly. That's the most of the work that the officers do has nothing to do with crime. And so to just basically look at what their day-to-day life is like. And aside from research, I think it's very important to read, and to read widely. And by that, I mean not just reading nonfiction that is about that character's background or history or culture, but also reading fiction from that character's culture. So to return to the example of the Iraq War vet, I read a number of novels that were written by veterans of the Iraq War. I read a lot of nonfiction by the same. And so it really is a question of using books to kind of immerse yourself in that world as you're creating the voices. Another way to approach these voices is to constantly check why you want to use that character and why you want to use that voice. And in my case, it was a story about community, and I could not tell this story about community by restricting myself only to the family of this Moroccan immigrant family, and I needed to kind of include other members of their community. The other thing that will, I'm sure, stand out to you if you read the book is that the landscape of Joshua Tree and the surrounding areas is very much a character in the novel. One of the things that I brought with me when I was working on the Moorish account is to really explore the role that landscape plays in our lives. This is something that I saw in that book, where my character kind of like goes through different transformations, and he's an explorer, so landscape is really important. And I really developed over the course of writing that book a love of writing about landscape. And it so happened that over the years, my husband and I had been going backpacking and camping in the area of Joshua Tree. And I really fell in love with the high desert. And I knew I wanted to set a story in the high desert. And The Other Americans, since I wanted to work on something contemporary, and since it was a hit and run, I thought, perfect. I'm going to set it in a small town in the high desert. And that is going to create this sort of world in the novel, which is at once open because it is the high desert, but also closed because it's a small town. And there are all kinds of suspicions about who might have committed this hit and run. And so I thought I might close by reading to you a paragraph from the book, just to give you a sense of what the prose might sound like. This is from the perspective of Mariam, who is the wife, mother, and business partner of Dries, the man who dies on the first page. When we moved to America 35 years ago, many things took me by surprise, like gun shops next to barber shops, freeways that tangled like yarn, people who knocked on your door to talk about Jesus, 20 different kinds of milk at the grocery store, signs that said, "Don't even think about parking here." I remember pointing them out to Dries. They even have signs that tell you what you can't think. But above all, I was surprised by the talk shows, the way Americans love to confess on television. Men talked about their affairs or addictions or gambling problems. Women talked about their weight or plastic surgeries or the children they had outside marriage. Even teenagers had something to say, mostly about how terrible their parents were, and all of it like it was a normal thing. I couldn't stop watching. The television sat on top of the supply cabinet in the back of the donut shop, and while I was washing dishes or mopping floors, I would watch Sally or Donahue, which in those days were on in the middle of the afternoon when the shop was quiet. My brother had told me that watching television would help me improve my English. And I will say I learned a lot of new words like paternity test and artificial insemination and AIDS epidemic. But my trouble was pronunciation. How easy it was to say tree when I meant three, or udder when I meant other. I needed a lot of practice. In Casablanca, I had my 2 sisters, 3 uncles, and 8 cousins. But here in California, My brother was the only family I had, and he lived 130 miles away. I hadn't realized how far that was until we went from seeing him every day to seeing him once a month. And sometimes not even that often. For me, that was the hardest thing about living in America. Being so far away, it was like being orphaned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laila. That was absolutely fabulous. I really, really enjoyed it. Just hearing your story was so amazing.
Thank you.
You're welcome. As you can imagine, we have quite a few questions from our audience, so I'm going to turn to our grantees now, and we'll have some Q&A. So Laila, our first question comes from our grantee, Michelle, from the Pasadena Public Library. Michelle?
Thank you so much, Amy. And I just want to thank the Pasadena Literary Alliance for being such a big supporter of the Pasadena Library through the years. I really appreciate that. And Laila, it's an honor to be here with you today and getting to ask a question. My name is Michelle Pereira, and I'm the Pasadena Public Library Director. And Laila, could you tell me what prompted you to give Nora synesthesia, or in this case, seeing color in sounds?
There were a couple of reasons. One is, why not, right? I think that one of the things that happens a lot when you write characters who are people of color, non-white characters, there's a sense that everything within that character has to relate to their identity, like race and gender and class and all that, and everything has to be sort of self-contained. And then for white characters, you can actually explore any other range of characteristics. And I felt that, you know, I wanted this person to be real, and you know, this happens to be the way that she views the world, and it has nothing to do with her family history. It has nothing to do with details of her identity. It has everything to do with how her brain works and how she sees music. And the other reason is that it is my understanding that a number of musicians have that. And I thought it would be really cool in terms of the writing to see if I could use it in some way and to have the character who actually sees color in sound. And I thought it would be kind of a nice thing to have in the narrative, periodically have it pop up in the narrative.
So our next question is from Karen, who is from our grantee Right Girl. Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Taylor, Executive Director of Right Girl. We're thrilled to be here today and grateful for all the support from the festival. My question today is, of the 9 voices you use in the novel, whose was perhaps the most difficult for you to write?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would say that the most challenging voice was perhaps the voice of AJ. Because this is a very troubled young man. And he's also, shall we say, what's the technical term? Racist. And so it really was a big challenge to write this character in the first person. But at the same time, I felt that it would be wrong not to include that voice, because if my aim was to tell the story of this community, I could not make it seem like it's not the community that it really is. And there are racists among us, and you know, they live in the same world that we all inhabit. And so the challenge became how to create a voice like this. In the book, one of the things that I ended up doing is including only a few chapters, because I wanted to give that voice its proper space, but no more. Because I think that there is a limit to empathy. Empathy is necessary, because without it, you would not be able to imagine yourself in the body of another character, in the voice, in the mind, in the heart of another character. So it is part of the task of the writer to develop a certain kind of imaginative empathy. But it does have its limits, because it works kind of in the same way as this idea of tolerance. You can tolerate up to a certain extent until you are facing intolerance. So you can't tolerate intolerance, right? And in the same way with empathy, like you can be empathetic with this character in the sense that you're trying to figure out who he is, but more than that would then become a denial of the self, if that makes any sense. And the key for me was realizing that nobody, or let me just reflect. The key for me was realizing that very few people wake up in the morning and say, yes, I am filled with hate towards other people. I am a, you know what I mean? Like typically it starts with, I'm not racist, but, right? That's, you know, and that's because the voice that we use to narrate who we are tends to be maximally generous towards the self and maximally empathetic towards the self. So once I realized that that's how he looks at himself, he looks at himself as a, he refuses to believe that he's a victim of circumstance, but at the same time, he uses circumstance to explain why he holds the views that he does. In other words, it's other people's fault if he feels this way. So that was kind of the key in working this through this character. And it was really a huge, huge, huge challenge to write that voice, for sure.
So our next question comes from Right Girl, from Sophia. Sophia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sophia Aguilar. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a current student at Sarah Lawrence College and an alum of Right Girl. So my question is, some of the characters in the book talk directly to the readers, breaking that wall between the character and the reader. Could you talk to us a little bit about why you chose to do that?
Sure. Thanks very much for that question. It's interesting. In writing the book, one of the things that I focus on a lot is thinking about issues of point of view. And when you use the first person point of view, you are giving voice to a particular character. And it's always important to me to know not just who is speaking, but to whom, because when you speak to a different person, the voice is going to be different. We don't speak the same, like I'm not going to speak the same to you as I might to my neighbor or my husband or somebody I disagree with, or, you know, we modulate our voices depending on who we speak to. And I think in the book, in having all of these characters speak, periodically I felt that it was kind of nice to break the fourth wall in the sense that you are reminded that somebody is listening to these narratives, and that person is curious. You know, for example, one moment where this happens is with the detective. So when the story begins with the daughter, it's kind of, you know, the daughter is just remembering what happened with her father 5 years ago when he died. But with the detective, it's like, it's as if somebody's asking her, well, what happened exactly at that moment? And then she responds. So it gives it a sort of like documentary-like feel to the narrative. I hope that answers your question.
From our grantee, the English division of Pasadena City College, we have a question from Simona. Simona?
Hi, everyone. My name is Simona Supekar. I teach English and creative writing at Pasadena City College. I just want to say that I'm really honored to be here. Laila, I'm a huge fan of your work, and thank PFWA for their generous support of our programs. So I had a question sort of about setting and thinking about coming from Morocco and setting your book in Joshua Tree. It's a long way from Morocco to Joshua Tree. So why did you decide to go with the setting of Joshua Tree?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So it's interesting because Morocco as a landscape is actually really quite diverse. So it's similar to California in the sense that you have parts of Morocco that can be quite temperate, and then you have a desert part in the south, and then in the north you can have, you know, snow and all of that. So it's really quite a diverse landscape. And as it happens, I was born and raised in Rabat, which is on the Atlantic coast. It's the capital. And in I had never actually gone further south than Ouarzazate, which is like the last big city before you go into the desert. So I've actually never been to the desert in Morocco. I mean, I've been to sort of like the sort of outermost city there, but not quite deep into the desert. And I lived in Los Angeles a good, I would say, a good 15 years before I even set foot in in Joshua Tree. And I was really surprised because the landscape, so this is the high desert, so it's different from just a straight up desert. And and when I all I knew about Joshua Tree, honestly, was the U2 album. I didn't I did not know more than that. And then when we went there, it was really to go camping, and there was something about the desert that really spoke to me, which took me by surprise, because I have always been a big city person. I grew up in Rabat, and I lived in London, and I lived in LA. I mean, these are all metropolises, and I did not think of myself as a sort of a desert person. And so then we go into the Mojave, and it was just, there was something about the landscape that made me fall in love with it. And I suspect it's sort of the size, because it just feels like so vast, and it's so quiet, which is such a contrast to the city. And I just love the silence. And I think that this love of silence comes from the fact that, when you write, you spend all of your day, alone. And so you kind of really learn to appreciate a bit of peace and quiet. And you go there and it's so quiet. And so I always associate it with creativity, and I associate it, so it has this positive connotation. And then the other thing is that it's a landscape that it seems like it's dead, but it's actually throbbing with life. And what it is it requires you to pay attention. It requires you to look a little more closely. So for these reasons, I just fell in love with it. And because I wanted to write the story about community, and it all kind of percolated at the same time. This starting to go to Joshua Tree more frequently was happening right around the time that I started working on the novel. It kind of just coalesced in the writing of the book.
So now we have a question from Catherine. Go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, Laila. My name is Catherine Kay. I'm a committee member with the festival and a mentor with Right Girl. Thanks so much for being here today. It's been wonderful to listen to you. My question is actually about your next work, Conditional Citizens, which is nonfiction. And I'm wondering how it was for you moving from fiction to nonfiction.
Oh, that's a great question. I've actually been writing nonfiction during the entire time that I was writing fiction. It's just that for me, they run on two tracks. Fiction projects take years, and I spend time working on them. And then I was always in parallel with that, working on nonfiction in a variety of different genres. I wrote book reviews for a while, although I think I haven't done that in the last year. But for many years, I wrote a lot of book criticism, personal essays, cultural criticism, columns. I wrote, and I'm supposed to be writing a column for The Nation magazine. So I've always written nonfiction in parallel with the fiction. And a few years ago, I thought it was time to sort of put together ideas that had been that I had been thinking about and exploring in nonfiction for a while, and have them sort of coalesce under one single theme in one book. And so Conditional Citizens is the result of that, because it's looking at my relationship to this country. I'm an immigrant, and then I became a citizen, so I'm a naturalized citizen. And it's really thinking about citizenship and the social contract, and basically how we all relate to the state and how the state relates with us. And that grew out of, observing how my own relationship with the state began. So the book starts off with my citizenship ceremony, and then from there it looks at different things that are going on in the US right now, and uses the lens of race and gender and national origin and religion to look at different issues relating to citizenship in America. And it comes out September 22nd.
Laila, we have time for one last question. Can you tell us what you're working on now?
It's a great question, because it happens to be in the middle of when we all went back into lockdown here in California. So I'm working on an essay actually about the pandemic and how it's affected our lives, but also again relating to this idea of citizenship and how we relate to one another. Like, what do we owe others, and what do others owe us in order for us to sort of survive this pandemic and be on the other side of it.
Thank you, Laila. We so appreciate your being with us today. Please stay safe. I'd also like to thank our Zoom audience. It's been a pleasure to host you and to host our author. Please support our mission by making a donation and purchasing a book or two by using the links at the end of this video or on the PFWA website. Thank you and so long.
Thank you.